Hey, hey, how are y'all doing? What is up? What is up? What is up? I'm gonna give some folks a few minutes to get into this broadcast. Hey, hey, what's up, JB? What's going on? Mario, what's up? All right, so thank you all, and I'm sure hopefully some more people, and I will be able to interact with you because I do have Facebook Live pulled up here on my computer. So want to take this opportunity to, before I hit record on the podcast, just to say thank you. I'm looking forward to getting this chapter of everything started, this next chapter of my life started. Many of you have seen me when I was doing the Morning Takeover radio show, and that was kind of the impetus of me getting into broadcasting and doing something like this, and so therefore I got excited about it, and I said, hey, you know what, once I stopped doing the show, why should I stop broadcasting? And so that's where I'm at, and started to do this podcast. And so here, this is my first podcast, and this is my first recording. So thank you all for being part of it. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get this party started. Okay. All right, let me hit record here and then we can get going. Hey, hey, and this is your boy Sillethoughts, and you are listening to the inaugural My3Cents Podcast. So I am very excited to be here. I'm so excited I even put on my good draws. And you know, you put on your good draws, something is really, really special. That's only for the good dates, the dates you're going to close the deal on, whatever you're going to do. When you bust out the good draws, you know something is up and something is very, very special to you. So thank you again. You're listening to the My3Cents Podcast. A little bit about me. I go by the handle Sillethoughts, and Sillethoughts came from, I basically use the African American tradition of taking something that was an insult or something that was bad and making it good. So my older sister used to say my name spelled backward was Silly, S-I-L-L-E. My government name, first name is Ellis. So she said, oh, you're silly, you're silly. So as I got older and started writing a blog, I used the pseudonym Sillethoughts because those were my thoughts, and I just took that name and flipped it around, and now it has become my call sign, Sillethoughts. My 3 cents. Why am I calling the podcast My 3 Cents? Well, it is my thoughts, my kind of impressions of what's going on in the world, what's going on in society. And when I pledged my fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, my line number was 3. So it's a play on the colloquialism of, you know, put your 2 cents on it. I just decided, oh, I'm going to take it up one notch because my line number was 3, and I gave it my 3 cents. Therefore, it is the My 3 Cents Podcast. So, not that you needed to know that, but if you do not know me, if you're listening to this podcast, you'd like to know who you're listening to and what these names mean. So that's it. That's what Sillethoughts is, and that's what My 3 Cents is. Now, what is this podcast going to be about? Well, at first, to be honest with you, I was going to do this kind of more entertainment focused, news focused kind of podcast. And I said, and that would have been fun, but you know, that's not what I do. I like people to think, I like people to walk away with something that gives them food for thought. And so therefore, the My 3 Cents Podcast is I might still do some pieces about what's going on in the world of entertainment. I might still do something about what's going on in sports. I love sports. I love entertainment. I love all of those things. And we're going to talk about it. But we're also going to look at it from a perspective that's going to give you some nuggets that you can use in your life. Hopefully, later on in your life, or at some point you say, you know what, I heard this podcast and gave me a different perspective on something. And so that's the goal. I'm not trying to change your opinions. What I am trying to do is get you something to think about. And that's what this podcast is and will be going forward, as long as you all continue to listen. So real quick, I am, for those of you that are going to be listening to this podcast, I do simulcast broadcast on Facebook Live, and so this video will be going up on my YouTube page, which is Sillethoughts on YouTube. And so there are multiple ways to get this podcast. And I want to give a shout out to everybody that's joining in the chat room on Facebook Live. Some of my old folks, Ray, my cousin, I see Faith, The Voice is on there. I need to have you on the show. JB, Mario, y'all been supporting from the beginning. Brian Pink, shout out to you and all of your support for the things I've been posting and talking about on Facebook. Lou, I think I already gave Faith a shout out. I'm giving Michael George, everybody that's joining and everybody that will continue to join us throughout this podcast and this broadcast. Thank you all for joining us this evening. So tonight's show is, I won't say controversial or explosive, but it is based on what has been really going on hot in the news right now. And as many of you know, there are 4 congresswomen that have been critical of the president. And many of you know I've been critical of the president. We all have that. That's our rights. Part of the First Amendment rights to be critical of government. That's how this country was formed. They were critical of the English government and decided to form a more perfect union. And so being critical of the government is quintessentially American. However, these 4 congressmen happen to be congresspersons of color, and your president, the president, in a late night tweet storm, which he is known to do, said, if you are so unhappy here, go back to where you came from. That's a summation of what he said. I mean, you can go and look at the tweets and see what he said, which he has since backed off from because of media pressure. But that's what he said. Go back to where you came from. It's crime infested and poor government, blah, 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 blah. But come to find out, 3 of the 4 congresswomen were born here in America. So where are they going to go back to? New Jersey? I didn't understand that, for one. And one of them is a Somalian refugee, and y'all can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but she has been an American citizen longer than the First Lady. So that doesn't make any sense. But you have to pull, that's why when you pull back the layers, people were using that R word, racist, by his comments. Because when he was going back and forth with John McCain, God rest his soul, he never told John McCain to go back to where he came from. When he was going back and forth with Ted Cruz during the presidential election, Ted Cruz is from Canada. He never told him to go back where he came from. So he's real selective in his language, and he's deliberate. And so people say, oh, it was just, why do we have to always bring up race? Well, he made it about that. Where is he saying where they came from? They're Americans. Naturalized or born, they're American citizens. So to go back to where they came from, tell me to go where I came from, I'm going back to Jacksonville, Florida. My ancestry is African in origin, but where I'm from is Jacksonville, Florida, in the United States of America. So that's a clear distinction, and it speaks to the larger belief by many Americans, I won't say all, by many Americans, that minorities don't have full rights in this country. And that is disturbing. That is supremely disturbing when you think about the contributions that minorities have made in this country to build this country. Now that's a whole nother conversation, a whole nother topic of conversation. But let's just, in the broader sense, why does he feel entitled to express to 4 women of color that are in Congress to go back where they came from? Okay, so I could spend the rest of this podcast just kind of banging on the president and those idiotic comments and calling them racist, which the litany of newspapers and articles and things that I posted and watched and said, and they have all called it racist. And then you've got these people that are saying, oh, it wasn't racist, he's just criticizing them, blah, blah, blah. So, since I want this podcast to be something to make people think, I said, okay, let's go to the next step. What is the next step? Why do? And then he went to his another one of his pep rallies in North Carolina, which I don't understand. He was elected in 2016. He's still holding pep rallies, but I guess that's to make himself feel good. But in one of his pep rallies in North Carolina, he sat quietly as the people in the room started shouting, "Send them back, send them back, send them back." So I'm like, wow, this is incredible. Like, there is a room full of people that believe that these women aren't American. And then there's all the snippets. Oh, they hate America. They hate Israel, which I don't know why Israel came into it, but they hate America. And they want open borders. They want this. They want that. It's all these. And then when you say, well, the president is racist. Oh, no, he's not. But you can make a clear distinction of what those 4 congresswomen want. But when somebody on the other side says, well, this is what the president wants. Oh, no, you're misreading it. Okay, I got it. So it got me to thinking, how do those people feel okay and feel comfortable with shouting that in that room? Well, one, they were amongst like-minded people, but 2, why do they feel comfortable being filmed shouting that out? And that's the bigger question. So I started thinking, what is the psychology of racism? How is the mind of someone that is racist? And I'm going to say that word, and I don't like it, to be honest with you. As an African-American male, I don't like that word racist. I don't like to use it because it's inflammatory and it causes people to stop listening. They become very defensive. You call somebody a racist, then they start trying to tell you why they're not and how they're not and blah, blah, blah. And then they tell you you're using a race card, and then the conversation goes off the rails and you don't get back on really trying to learn and express yourself to somebody else. So I try not to use that word as much as possible. But you got to call a spade a spade. And and there are racists in this country, and there have been racists in this country since the beginning of this country, since before this country was even formed. There were racists because there was slavery before there was United States of America. So there was racism in America. It's woven into the fabric. I heard a quote today. I read a quote today. It was perfect. It said, racism is so American that sometimes it feels like when you're protesting racism, it feels like you're protesting America. And I was like, wow, that's very profound, because that's what it feels like. I mean, if you're really thinking about it, that's what it feels like. When you start protesting racism in America, white Americans, tend to get really sensitive and act like you're protesting America, you're protesting the flag, you're protesting our country, and if you don't like it, you can get out. So are you saying that if we don't like racism, if we don't accept there's an acceptable amount of racism that we have to endure as a minority, and if we don't like that, then we can leave and go back to where you brought us from? It's really should be the correct terminology. But with that being said, I had the thought of, what is the psychology of racism? So I wrote a blog, which will go up on my blog site about this, but I broke it down into what are the parts of racism that makes up the psyche of somebody that's a racist. The first thing, part 1 of it, is xenophobia. And xenophobia is defined as the fear or hatred of that which is perceived to be foreign or strange. Okay, that is the foundation of racism. Xenophobia can involve perceptions of an in-group towards an out-group, and can manifest itself in suspicion of the activities of others and a desire to eliminate their presence to secure a presumed purity, and may relate to the fear of losing national, ethnic, or racial identity. I know you're not supposed to have dead air when you're doing a podcast, but just kind of let that sink in a little bit. I'm going to read that one more time just for the folks that are just joining us. Um, Xenophobia can involve perceptions of an in-group towards an out-group and can manifest itself in suspicion of the activities of others and a desire to eliminate their presence to secure a presumed purity, and may relate to a fear of losing national, ethnic, or racial identity. So the foundation of racism is xenophobia. You see somebody that has a different skin color, different hair texture, different type of features, you immediately become wary or just suspicious of them based purely on their appearance, not on anything that they've done or haven't done towards you or to you or for you. It's based purely on their appearance. And then you feel that that person and their appearance, their ethnic makeup, is a threat to your national, ethnic, or racial identity. There was a book, it's called the ISIS Papers. It was, no, that's not the ISIS Papers. What was the book? It may have been the ISIS Papers. But it was basically talking about how the fear that, it's a black psychiatrist that wrote it, and she was talking about the fear that many white Americans have about how they can be eliminated from this planet without any wars, just by the mixing and commingling of races, of ethnic groups, that white can be completely eradicated. And so that is the underlying fear that causes the xenophobia for many people of European descent. So you read the book, like I said, I think it's the ISIS Papers. Y'all can correct me if I'm wrong. I know y'all are very smart people in the chat room, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that was the ISIS Papers that theory was espoused. So, first part of racism, xenophobia. The second part is dehumanization. And dehumanization describes the denial of full humanness to others and the cruelty and suffering that accompany it. So basically, in your mind, you say, they're not human, so therefore what I'm doing is not wrong. They are, slaves were equated to cattle, to property. And so therefore, the mistreatment of human beings, rape, beatings, murder, being viewed as property, etc., were able to be carried out without any feelings of guilt, because you have dehumanized that person. You have said, okay, that's not a real person in your mind, and it's a trick that the military uses to send people off to war, to be able to get them to kill without remorse. To say, okay, I have to dehumanize my enemy. They're my enemy. They're out to kill me. You make all these things, and you beat that into them. You weave that into them to the point where they're like, okay, that's not a Vietnamese person. That is whatever slur they used during that time, and so therefore I can kill them or rape them or do whatever the thing else and move away. My conscience is still clear. I'm not violating any rules of law or God or nature because you have dehumanized them. So that is first key component of racism is xenophobia. Second key component is dehumanizing the other ethnic group. So now we've got two parts. Now the third part is a little bit tricky because this is where it becomes psychological. And there are a number in psychoanalytic theory that was espoused by Freud, and his daughter Anna created defense mechanisms, talked about psychological defense mechanisms that we use to protect our psyche. And so we've got, I won't go too deep into psychoanalytic theory, but Freud talked about the id, the ego, and the superego. Id being our kind of natural human animalistic impulses, sex, food, those type of things. Our ego is our conscious mind, those things that we want, that we try to manipulate. And our superego are our ability to raise above the id and the ego and to be self-actualized, to do grander things that are out beyond the self. So the id, ego, and superego. We spend most of our time satisfying id and ego impulses and very little time in satisfying superego kind of pursuits. But be that as it may, Anna Freud wrote a number of psychological defense mechanisms, and this is what we do to defend ourselves from uncomfortable impulses. So one of the most primitive impulses, defense mechanisms we use is called denial. All right. Denial is primarily used by people with low intelligence or those with high intelligence. The former cannot create a suitable argument, while the latter uses their position as an intellect to bolster the believability of their denial. Simply stated, denial is a refusal to accept reality or fact, acting as if a painful event, thought, or feeling did not exist. Many people, many races, since we're talking about racism and races tonight, many races have used this defense mechanism to talk about the Holocaust. There are Holocaust deniers out there, and whole websites dedicated to saying that the Holocaust was a hoax to elevate Jewish people in society. We say, well, wow, that's incredible. That doesn't make any sense. There's all this video and all this evidence, but denial doesn't look at evidence and video and all that other stuff as being true. It's part of a psychological defense mechanism called denial. And it gives them the reason to say, okay, this is why I dislike Jewish people, because they created this hoax about the Holocaust to get us to feel, sympathy for them. And they go all the way down there, and they get very, very angry. And that's why racism and racists tend to get very, very angry when you challenge their views, because it is a psychological defense mechanism. And when you start undoing it, that psychic pain comes into play, and that's why they get angry. So when we're challenging people about racism, understanding that we're challenging the way that they protect themselves. And when you do that, you have to be prepared for them to get angry and upset, because you are basically taking away their defenses. One of the other ways that they defend themselves is called regression. Regression is a reversion to an earlier stage of development in the face of unacceptable thoughts or impulses. So what does that mean? Okay, what does regression mean? It means, like, in a macro sense, it can be like somebody reaching adolescence, they had a traumatic, and they're having some trauma, whether they're being bullied or whatever, and they regress back to a childlike state because that's more protective of their psyche. What regression in a racist happens is this. They start to fantasize about a time when race and their race or racism was okay, was an acceptable part of society, and they don't have to be politically correct. That's why you see a lot of people getting upset about being politically correct, because they don't want to. They want to be able to express their racist or misogynistic or sexist views with impunity, without having to face consequences. Now that they have to face consequences, they get upset. So they want to regress to that time, to where they could do all that stuff and get away with it. And thus, you have Make America Great Again. This is the ultimate regression. Because when people were asked to specifically say, what does that mean to you? Most people of European descent in this country said the 50s. Well, the 50s weren't a great time for African Americans. The 50s weren't a great time for any minority in this country. The 50s weren't a great time for women in this country. The 50s were only great for white Anglo-Saxon men in America. But that's the time that they point to, because the racists knew their place. You could call somebody a nigga and it was okay. You could get on television, you could get whatever and say, segregation now, segregation forever, George Wallace and the whole nine. And it was great for them. And so they said, make America great again. That's the America that they want to have. And so regression is the psychological defense mechanism that says, if we could only go back to where it was, America would be great. So that's another psychological defense mechanism of racism. Compartmentalization is another defense mechanism, and that is basically when it's a lesser form of disassociation, wherein parts of oneself are separated from awareness of other parts and behaving as if one had separate sets of values. Okay, so that's a very complicated way of saying this. I have a black friend, so therefore I can't be racist. Those are the people that compartmentalize. Because they say, because they have compartmentalized their friendship, that relationship. They say, because I like Joe or Will or Bill, therefore I must like all black people. And that's not necessarily true. You can't extrapolate that. You have compartmentalized, I gotta say that. Ooh, I need a drink. That's tough. You have compartmentalized that relationship, and you're trying to extrapolate it to make yourself feel better by saying, because I have this relationship means that I can't be a racist. And that's the furthest from the truth. And so, or on the flip side, if any of you watched that video of those white women in Texas, and they were asking them about the president's tweet about going back, they didn't feel it was racist. And one of them raised her hand and said, well, Bob Johnson said is supporting the president, so therefore, how could he be racist? And that was probably one of the most idiotic arguments that I've ever heard. And it was, in her mind, it made perfect sense. Because what happens is she has compartmentalized all black people. She had made all black people a monolith. And so therefore, if one is in support of the president and he's done all this stuff, therefore he can't be a racist. Because, of course, all of us would have to believe or accept that it wasn't racist. So it's very, very, and it's all this, a lot of this is unconscious. So, you know, when you, like I said earlier, when you start trying to pull back the layers with somebody, you have a real discussion, they'll start to get upset because you're really undoing a feeble psychological defense. This is not real. This is not rational thought. This is irrational thought. So we're in this realm of irrational because we're talking about psychological defense mechanism in a pathological point of view, not from a rational, healthy point of view. We're talking about a pathology, and racism does fall in some sort of, it does meet some criterion of pathology. So moving on. Another defense mechanism that's utilized by racists is projection. And this is one of the most used psychological defenses by racists. It's fueled by the xenophobia that I mentioned earlier in this show. And it also causes the biggest divide between races because this is the psychological version of gaslighting. Basically, projection is a misattribution of a person's undesired thoughts, feelings, or impulses onto another person or race who does not have those thoughts, feelings, or impulses. So, again, fancy way of saying, basically, I feel a certain way that is causing me to feel guilty. I may want to harm someone. I may want to hurt someone. I may have these feelings deep down in my unconscious. And so I look at you and say, you're violent. So think about in this country, the Native Americans assisted the colonizers to stay alive in this country. There was disease. They could not figure out the land, whatever. It was the Native Americans that helped them. Once the Native Americans had lost their usefulness, they became savages. They had to project onto them some sort of distasteful or distrustful ideology so they could carry out the genocide of that people. Again, dehumanization. So this is all kind of woven into the psychology of racism. So you think about, now we're just adding on, now we're just talking about layers upon layers. So it makes it very, very hard to unpack racism and a racist because all of these layers are in there. Projection. It was projected onto the African slaves. Oh, where they're savages, they're violent, they're this, they'll rape us, so therefore we have to keep them in captivity. They wouldn't know what to do if we weren't there. We're helping them. These are the thoughts that were used to create and prolong slavery for all those years. And it's irrational, yeah. So you could be sitting there, you could be listening, you could be wherever you're listening, wherever you're watching, if you're watching right now, you're like, that doesn't make any sense. Absolutely. Because you're trying to apply rational thought to irrational behavior. Stop it. Please, stop it. Okay? You cannot apply rational thought to irrational behavior. You'll hear me say that many times. If you continue to listen to my podcast, I'm going to say that numerous times. One of my favorite phrases. Do not apply rational thought to irrational behavior. So projection is used to, and projection has been used to create laws. You know, and projection has been used, oh my God, we got to prevent them from doing this. We got to prevent them from doing that. So even when the 13th Amendment was written, that eliminated slavery, and I'm using air quotes for those of you that are going to be listening to this podcast, that eliminated slavery, there was a provision that basically said if you committed a crime, you could go back to being a slave. And so what happened? Vagrancy laws were written, all these crazy laws. If you couldn't read, even though slaves weren't taught to read, but if you couldn't read, you go to jail, and they put you right back on the plantation. So it was, okay, the 13th Amendment and all those abolitionists and all those things, yes, they did those things. Some of those things were done just to lower some of the feelings, the guilt that they had associated with the treatment of the Africans in America. But they didn't want to go too far. So it's this constant flux of we're doing good, but we're not. We're doing good, but we're not. And that's the ebb and flow of racism. It's not, there are very few people, and I will say this to the day I die, there are very few people that are just staunch, full on, I hate everybody kind of racist. There are people that you know, there are a few people that are on that hardcore, but there are people that flow in and out. They have racist thoughts and feelings, but not all the time. So we got to figure out, we got to unpack the psychology, where they are in their racial identity development. So coming, you know, wrapping this segment up, but okay. So displacement, that's another psychological defense mechanism. It's the redirecting of thoughts, feelings, or impulses directed at one person or object, but taken out on another person or object. In a short version, thanks, Car. In a short version, that's the person that's mad at work, has a bad day at work, comes home and kicks the dog. That is displacement. That's what it is. In the macro sense, in the American sense, it could be someone where you're mad at your company for closing the factory and sending it overseas. You can't say that. You don't want to say that. So you blame Mexicans for coming and taking your job. You say, okay, that's an easy target. Fox News and other conservative outlets say, they're coming over here to take your jobs. No. Those Mexicans that came over here, legally or illegally, didn't close that factory. Matter of fact, they're coming trying to get the wages that the factory is trying to avoid. So it's actually counterintuitive to think that Mexicans are coming here to take their jobs. Matter of fact, if they want that job, they could just stay in Mexico, because that's where a lot of those factories are going to get done. They're going south to Mexico because the wages are cheaper. So the people that are coming here aren't coming here to take your job. They're coming here to make a better life, to not get paid lower wages that these factories that are closing in America and being shipped overseas are doing. So let's, make sure that we're mad at the right thing. So that's displacement. We are displacing our anger for people who look like us, that are part of our ethnic group. We're displacing our anger for them, and we're placing it on other people because, again, we're xenophobic. They're dehumanized, they're less than, so therefore, and we're using projection. So all of this psychology starts piling up, and now we're really building the anatomy of a racist. Undoing is another psychological defense mechanism that's used. In short, undoing is the attempt to take back an unconscious behavior or thought that is unacceptable or hurtful. So in layman's terms, that's basically you say something or do something that is completely racist, and then you apologize for it, and you say, that's not what's in my heart. And how many times have we heard that from a politician or for somebody, a celebrity or whatever, that had to apologize for saying or doing something that was racist or sexist, but they would stand there and say to you with a straight face, that's not in my heart. That's not what's in my heart. Well, then why'd you say it? Why'd you do it? It was there. It's in you. You know, it's funny. And there are very few people there's some people that I know that I'm associated with that are not African American. They are white Americans, and I know that even if we had the biggest argument, they would never call me a nigger. It's not in their heart. It's not who they are. I believe that. And then there's some people that I know that if we got into that same argument, nigga would come out very quickly because it's in them. And so that's just really what it is. And they try to undo it and they would say, oh, I'm so sorry. That's not what's in my heart. Yeah, it is. It was there. It was in your toolbox and you pulled it out. So they try to undo it by apologizing, but it's really part of who they are. So finally, we talk about rationalization. That's always, that's another defense mechanism. So, rationalization is what people use when you say, an unarmed black man was killed on camera, and you say, well, the rationalization says, well, what did he do? Because you want to be able to rationalize a murder. You want to be able to rationalize this behavior. Well, the police, that job is very stressful. Well, yeah, they've been able to carry that stressful job out without having to kill somebody. Dylan Roof is still alive, and he murdered 9 people. So he is the definition of dangerous, but yet they took him in without incident, and there's countless examples. Now, I won't say it's all police, but I saw Muhammad Ali said one time that if 10,000 snakes are coming down the hill, and in those 10,000 snakes, 1,000 of them are poisonous, how am I supposed to determine which one is which? You've got to get rid of the snakes. You've got to get rid of the snakes that are in the uniform. We can't continue to put them on desk, put them on administrative leave, fire them from one office, but don't say why you fired them so they can go get hired somewhere else. We cannot continue to shuffle these bad police officers around. That's a rationalization for the mistreatment of black and brown people. But again, you're listening to the My3Cents Podcast, you're watching the My3Cents Podcast, and right now we're talking about the anatomy or the psychology of racism. So some of the things I'm saying might feel disturbing, it might make you feel uncomfortable. You need to put pause, you need to take a step away. You can. I'm going to take a sip of this lovely beverage I have in front of me. And keep it moving. So, finally, the part 4 of racism, and this may make people feel a little uncomfortable, so brace yourself. In the psychology of racism, a part of it, and it's separated from the psychology part, is religion. Religion has played a crucial and important part in the creation and sustaining of racism. And it pains me as a Christian to say that, because I believe in God. I believe in Jesus, and I believe that everything that I was taught in church is true. At the same time, God's word can be twisted and distorted to satisfy and sustain a racist doctrine. Well, how can it do that? Because when you mistreat a group of people for 400 years, if you are afraid of them getting some get back, you say, no, love your neighbor. You teach them the entire time. As African slaves were brought here, they were indoctrinated in religion. Loving your neighbor as yourself. Forgiveness, all of these things that are in religion it kept the slaves and it kept black people to this day from getting really, really upset and violent about what has been happening to us in this country. I get upset about it. And so, but those people, as the man JB is saying in the chat room, they're not using the scripture for how it really is. They're bastardizing the scripture to meet their needs. So yes, is slavery in the Bible? It is in the Bible. Moses was freeing the Israelites from bondage and captivity in Egypt. They were slaves. Now, they weren't treated as the way the slaves were treated here in America. At least there's no historical evidence of that. But they were still in captivity and bondage, and technically they were slaves. So yes, in a literal sense, there is slavery in the Bible. However, I don't think that's mixing Old and New Testament. So if you're a Christian, that means you're a follower of Christ. In the New Testament, Christ said, love thy neighbor as thyself. So you have to say, well then, only my neighbor can look like me in order to be a Christian in that sense. And that's how I feel about a lot of the evangelicals, because they're very, very specific in the doctrines and the causes that they take up. Oh, they're all about abortion, but black man gets killed in the street. Oh, don't hear anything about that. And they want us to forgive when the president makes a mistake and makes a misstep, but they're not so willing to forgive other people of color if they make a misstep or mistake, and they start attributing a lot of things. But again, religion is used to assuage a lot of guilt. You go to church, religion tells you to repent, confess, repent, and your sins are forgiven. To a racist, that's like a get out of jail free card. You can say, I can do what? And all I have to do is, or if I have these thoughts or these feelings or impulses, I don't even have to go and do anything. If I have these thoughts and feelings and impulses and beliefs, if I go and I confess and I repent, or if I go to church and I donate to church, then therefore I'm forgiven. Now, I'm not going to go down that road. We could talk about religion on another podcast, and I would love to talk about religion and the thoughts about religion on another podcast, but we're talking about it in the context of racism. And we say, okay, on the flip side of that, as an African American, we have adopted the God has allowed us to suffer. This is from God. God is allowing our people to suffer this way. So you're like, wait a minute. So religion can be used on both sides. It could be used on the side of the oppressor to say, hey, we're helping you, but you got to forgive us. And on the side of the oppressed, you could say, God is punishing us for something that we may have done. And he's allowing this to happen to us. So therefore, we can't question God. And I'm sure a lot of slaves were born and died with that belief. So, I'm saying, wow, that is a lot. That is a lot. You've got xenophobia, dehumanization, projection, all these different things. And then you tack a religion on top of it. Now can you see, I'm hoping we can all see how really significant and how complex racism really is. It's not as simple as you hate me because I'm black. That is the most simplest terms of it. It is deeper than that. You're asking someone to acknowledge that they've been lied to their entire life. Because they say, we built this country. Really? How did you do that? And when you say, how did you do that? Well, we had to befriend the Native Americans to learn how to live here, and then we murdered them and took their land. And then we had to use our ships to go get African people because they were better suited to the conditions and get them to work for free to create King Cotton, which got us the money to be able to revolt from the British and start the United States of America. So right then, you had two groups of people that you utilized to build, and I'm using air quotes again, this country. But that story is loosely told in the books. Because that's not the story of America. The story of America is build yourself by your own bootstraps, and you can be anything you want to be. That's the theme of America, you know. And that's not really how everything played out. So, but for many Americans, many white Americans, that's what their belief system is built upon. And that the slaves were happy. That's even written in some of the textbooks. And that that's another compartmentalization that we talked about earlier tonight. It's earlier on this podcast. Is that there may have been a few stories where there were some slaves on it, that it was a good plantation owner, but there's more negative than there is positive. But if they find the positive, they can say, they grab onto it and they say, see? And they use it as an example for all. And that's not the way it was that's not the way it went down. But we're talking about the psychology of a racism and a racist, and we understand that it is a pathology. It is not a rational thought. And so therefore, they're going to try to rationalize irrational behavior. So that's why when the people that are watching right now on Facebook Live, you're like, that doesn't make sense. And I'm seeing your comments, and I wish, like, it's like, wow, it doesn't make sense because you're rational. It makes no sense because you're rational. But racism is not rational. It's pathological. And so we have to treat it as such. And so that's why I try to spend the bulk of this podcast, the first part of this podcast, talking about the pathology and how deep and complex it is. So when you all go back and you have these discussions, whether it's on Facebook or in person or whatever, and you talk about racism, you say, well, why can't you just see it my way? They can't see it your way because it's layers of pathology. There's centuries of pathology that has been built up to create racism. So it wasn't created overnight, so it can't be undone overnight. We have to have a clear mindset about it. We have to make sure that we're approaching it from the perspective of, okay, this is what I'm dealing with. I'm dealing with the pathology. And so when you deal with the pathology, as you start to undo it, understand they're going to get angry. Understand they're going to get pushed back and get defensive. Because basically what you're undoing is their way of thinking. And you're telling them that they're wrong. And if you're anything like me, nobody likes to be told that they're wrong. No one likes to be told that they're wrong. So, doesn't mean that they're any less wrong. Just saying that's what you're dealing with. That's what you have to do. That's what you're coming across. So, in summary on this portion of the podcast, and so thank you all, Jay Carter, I see you. In summary, we're talking about the psychology of racism. It begins with xenophobia. It also has a healthy dose of dehumanization. There are multiple psychological defense mechanisms in play to rationalize, whereas denial, regression, compartmentalization, projection, displacement, all of these different psychological defense mechanisms that keep the racists believing that their thoughts and impulses are real and rational. And then you put in a little, you clean it up with a little bit of religion. You cement it with some religion that says, hey, this is in God's hands. God is allowing this to happen. And I'm going to pray and repent. And that's how you get the psychology of racism and of a racist. So I'd like for you to hit me back or hit me offline or whatever. What do you think about my kind of breakdown of the psychology of racism? Did I go too far? Did I intellectualize it too much? That's also a defense mechanism, intellectualization. So maybe I'm doing it to defend myself from the pain of racism. You know, if I'm being clairvoyant, if I'm being completely transparent here, maybe this whole segment was about me trying to defend myself from the pain of racism. Could be, but it also could be true. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. So, let me know what you think about that, about the psychology of racism as we move on in this podcast. Second part of this podcast is about reparations. And this is the irony of this is that that was what this podcast was originally going to be about. It was going to be about reparations, and I was going to talk a little bit about Jeffrey Epstein and his trafficking of children and how he got that slap on the wrist in Florida. I was going to talk about that. I was going to talk about the basketball and LeBron and what's number two? Kyrie Irving and Anthony Davis and I'm drawing a blank right now. Who won the NBA Finals? The MVP. Paul George and your boy. Somebody tell me in the chat room. I'm going blank right now because I can't think of the guy that won the MVP of the NBA Finals. Anyway, so that part of it is what I was going to be talking about for tonight's show. But this whole thing, Kawhi, thank you. Mario, thank you. Kawhi. And all that stuff. So I was going to talk about how people, treat different NBA stars differently. And I'm going to save that for another show because I'm sure I might have some guests on to talk about that because I've had numerous kind of online and offline arguments about the difference in how people treated LeBron when he took his talents to South Beach versus people are treating Kawhi and giving him a pass as he's taking his talents to LA and then holding the LA Clippers ransom to get him another star, and then teasing the Lakers and thinking that he was going to come there even though their organization is a mess right now, and y'all can get mad at me all you want to, but he did tease the Lakers and making them think that he was coming, and all he was doing was stalling, waiting for Jerry West and the Clippers to get him another star to go to the Clippers. So we can talk about that and how, everybody says LeBron was chasing a ring, but didn't Kevin Durant leave Oklahoma City that went to the NBA Finals and had Golden State down 3-1? Didn't he go leave to join Golden State to win a ring? But we don't, and he got taken to task for that. I won't say that he didn't. But that's what comes up when we're talking about LeBron. Well, LeBron's doing what everybody else is doing. Or everybody else is doing what LeBron is doing. So if what LeBron was doing was so bad, why are they copying it? Why are they doing the same thing? I don't quite understand how, but I do understand. I do understand because LeBron is the closest challenge to Michael Jordan. Point blank period. And there are a number of people that are of my generation that grew up watching Michael Jordan. Yes, we grew up watching Bird and Magic, but Jordan was during our time. He was during our formative years, and he made us believe and love basketball. And he was the greatest, and he always will be the greatest. But I'm going to say this before I move on to talk about reparations, is that right now we sound like our parents. You remember when you was a kid, I used to go to your aunts and your uncles and your family used to all get together, and your uncle would say, man, y'all don't know nothing about insert sport here. That dude y'all got, now he ain't got nothing on insert player name here, whether it was Kareem or Wilt or Oscar Robinson or Jim Brown. Whoever we had wasn't good enough. The people in their era was better. And that's what's happening now. We are those people. We are our uncles saying nobody was better than Jordan. Okay. That's your belief. Now, how do you support it? If the only support you have is that he won 6 rings, never lost in the finals, and he was the finals MVP every time, that is a sound argument. But it's a team sport. The argument would be more sound is if it was an individual sport. If it was tennis and he never lost a final of a major, oh, okay. If he was a golfer like Tiger Woods and had to play the entire field by himself and ended up winning, or Jack Nicklaus, 19 majors, Tiger, 15, you have more credibility. But basketball is a team sport. And Michael Jordan had help. But nobody wants to say that. Nobody wants to say Michael Jordan had help. He did. So did LeBron. He didn't win until he got with D. Wade and Chris Bosh and Kyrie Irving and Kevin Love. Even when he went back to Cleveland, he had help. Every star had help. Kawhi is the closest to not having help this year. That Toronto team, you know, they were okay. They had a couple of all-stars. Some people, some veterans. But he was the closest to doing it by himself, if that's really happening. But everybody stepped up. You had a different person step up and do what they needed to do to help that team win. And, by the way, Golden State had 2 catastrophic injuries of 2 of their best players in order for it to actually happen. Kevin Durant had to tear his Achilles, and Klay Thompson had to tear his ACL in order for that to happen. So let's not just get so excited about what happened with Kawhi and Toronto. So, moving on, with that being said, I'm going to, the second part of the show is about reparations. And I want to make a case for reparations real quick because I got into this discussion, more like an argument, on Facebook with some friends that I went to high school with, most of whom were white, and most of whom were immediately dismissive of the thought of reparations. Oh my gosh, for African Americans. Oh my gosh, I'm not going to do that. Slavery happened such a long time ago. Talk about the psychology of racism. So we already talked about that earlier. But think about this, you know. So, oh, it happened such a long time ago. Nobody now owns a slave, so why would we have to pay for it? Blah, 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 blah. So I said, okay. Why is it such an issue? Why is it so summarily dismissed by many white Americans without even exploring it? Overall, it's an unpopular topic among Americans with 70% in opposition, with white Americans being the highest opposing group. So 70%. So I'm going to present both sides of this argument. Like 70% of Americans are in opposition of reparations for African Americans. We can talk about that, but that's where we are. But the conversation has been going on for years. 30 plus years. A conversation began in 1978 when U.S. Congressman John Conyers Jr. Proposed to have a commission study on how to appropriately compensate the descendants of slaves. That was in 1978. It was dismissed by progressives as being too progressive. So the progressives are saying it's too progressive. And all he wanted was a commission to study on how to effectively or how to appropriately compensate. He didn't say do it. He just said, hey, let's see how we can appropriately compensate the descendants of slaves. This was in 1978. And that was too progressive. Reparations have been paid in the United States, not just for slavery. So I'm going to give some clear examples of when reparations and how reparations have been paid by the United States in this country. So it has been done. The precedent has been set. United States paid Japanese Americans in World War II. In 1952, 125,000 Japanese Americans were interned in camps. In 1948, just 6 years later, Congress issued a reparation fund of $38 million and then awarded each survivor $20,000 in 1990. About 80,000 claimed reparations, totaling $1.6 billion. So they paid reparations to Japanese Americans for being interned during World War II for 6 years. $1.6 billion for 6 years of internment. The United States to the Aleutians, if I'm saying that wrong, please slap me, of Alaska in World War II. While it was fighting against the Japanese, the United States occupied the islands of Kiska and Attu in the Alaskan Aleutian chain and deported 881 Aleuts to camps in Juneau, Alaska, about 2,000 miles from the islands. In 1988, about 450 living survivors of the camps were awarded $12,000 each. When the Reparations Act was signed, the United States admitted that it had kept the Aleuts in captivity for much longer than required for safety and failed to provide sufficient care of them. In 1995, further compensation was given to the communities for the loss and damage to churches during the war. World War II again, United States to the Aleuts of Africa. Short period of time. United States to Holocaust survivors. In October of 2015, President Obama awarded $12 million in assistance to Holocaust survivors. The money was given to help these deserving survivors, to help these deserving survivors, to help the quarter of whom live below the poverty line. So, United States have paid reparations to Japanese Americans for being interned for 6 years. They gave reparations to the Aleuts of Alaska for being moved off of their islands longer than they were supposed to. United States gave to Holocaust survivors to help them move them above the poverty line, and we didn't commit the Holocaust. We gave President Obama $12 million to Holocaust survivors. United States gave reparations to Native Americans. It wasn't called reparations per se, let me say that, but thousands of American Indians are now in line to receive part of a $3.4 billion settlement with the federal government, ending a long-running dispute over government mismanagement of tribal lands and accounts. Under the finalized settlement, $1.5 billion will be distributed among individuals, with another $1.9 billion going towards buying some Indian slivers of land. The deal was finalized in 2012 and was characterized by then President Obama as clearing the way for reconciliation. President Obama twice. Jewish Americans for the Holocaust, and now to Native Americans for mismanagement of funds, basically $3.4 billion. North Carolina paid reparations to the eugenics victims. In 2013, North Carolina became the first state to pay reparations to victims of forced sterilization and eugenic programs through a $10 million agreement. Eugenic programs aimed at preventing reproduction of people who are incarcerated or believed to have physical and mental deficiencies were common in most U.S. states from the early 1900s. In 2015, Virginia, too, started a compensation program for victims of eugenic sterilization. Again, United States to the victims of the Tuskegee experiment. If you're African American, you should be familiar with the Tuskegee experiment. In 1932, the United States government left 399 black men with syphilis untreated in order to study the development of the disease. The study, called Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male, went on for 40 years. Overall, it involved 600 black men. 201 of them were in the control group, and the rest had syphilis. They were not offered treatment even after successful cures had been widely adopted. After an Associated Press expose led to the closure of the study, the victims filed a class action suit, settling for $10 million worth of reparations for the survivors of the study, their widows, and their offspring. In 1995, a guarantee of free lifetime medical care for the victims, their children, and spouses was added to the reparation sum. So, reparations were paid to the victims of the Tuskegee experiment. Florida paid reparations to the survivors of the Rosewood Massacre. Remember the movie Rosewood? Well, guess what? It was real, and Florida paid for it. In January 1923, the black town of Rosewood in Florida was destroyed in a racist massacre. After the lynching of an innocent black man in response to an alleged rape attempt A white mob attacked and destroyed Rosewood, burning homes and churches. At the time, the official death toll was 8. Yet at least 26 victims have now been confirmed, and the toll might be even higher. In 1994, the state of Florida issued $2.1 million in compensation to be split among the massacre survivors. City of Chicago paid reparations to the victims of police torture. In 2015, the City of Chicago acknowledged that more than 100 black prisoners had been subject to torture by the police, which pushed some to confess to crimes they hadn't committed. The city awarded 57 survivors a payment in cash, together with free college and social services. The total sum of $5.5 million was officially labeled as reparations, and Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel also issued an official apology and mandated that torture be studied in public school curricula. Again, those are all examples where the United States have paid reparations. So, it has been estimated that reparations could cost between 5 and 17 trillion. Yes, with a T. But to give you some perspective, the U.S. spent $604 billion on defense in 2016. That was 15% of the national budget. Any reparations to African Americans would have to be paid out over a specified time period, anywhere from 20 to 50 years. The goal, or the goals. The most important goal is acknowledgement of the actual mistreatment of African American people in this country. It's one thing to say you're sorry, it's another to show it. Number 2, closing the household income gap between black and white families. The average gap ranges between $125,000 and $150,000. Income gap between black and white families as a result of what has happened between Jim Crow, segregation, discrimination, and just generalized institutional racism in this country. Correcting discriminatory and unscrupulous practice that put African Americans at a societal disadvantage. For example, redlining, wage gaps, Jim Crow, segregation, over-policing, and sentencing, to name a few. Re-educating America as a whole. The extent of the treatment of African Americans during slavery and how our contributions have been excluded from American history needs to be corrected and rewritten. So those are the goals of reparations, not just a check. It's about righting the wrongs of history. So, a possible way reparations could be executed is to, 1, you have to establish your slave ancestry, okay? Just because you're black in America doesn't mean that you are a descendant of a slave. You know, there's a lot of people that have come into this country now and they may not have been a direct descendant of a slave. So you have to establish your slave ancestry. You have to establish a per person amount with population projections over a predetermined time frame of distribution. So let's say like you want to distribute it over 20 years, what's going to be the population of African Americans over that time as it increases? And then you determine an amount based on those projections. You split the funds between a fund for long-term household income to be distributed at the end of the predetermined period, cash disbursement for immediate use, and a fund for those areas where African Americans were disproportionately discriminated against. For example, housing, education, legal services, etc. So part of the funds will be an immediate check, part of the funds will be for long-term to close that wage, the income gap that we talked about, the household income gap, and then part of it would be to fund those areas where African Americans were disproportionately discriminated against. So help people build businesses, get education, housing, whatever. And I would say finally, there would be a separate wrongful death fund for those people of other races or ethnicities who were affected by attempting to assist African Americans post-slavery. Well, what does that mean? The Freedom Riders, for example, that went through the South were not just black Americans. There were white Americans on those buses, and many of those white Americans were killed, raped, or harmed as a result of their attempt to help African Americans gain civil rights. Those people and their families were affected by slavery. Indirectly, of course, but they were affected. Or directly, because their family members were raped or killed or murdered as a result. So there would be a separate fund for those people to get reparations as well. It would not be commingled with the funds for African Americans, but I think that the people and the families that have been on the right side of history need to be recognized and compensated as such. So, I have said a lot today. We have talked about the psychology of racism. We also kind of gave a brief history of reparations. How has it been paid in this country in the past? And so the precedent has been set. And I also gave my thoughts as to what the goals of reparations are for African Americans and a possible way for it to be executed that would be beneficial for all. For those, because I believe if you just gave everybody a check, they'll run out and spend it. And that's not a stereotype of African American people. That's just people in general. You give somebody a check, free money, they're gonna go spend it. And then it takes away from what it's intended to do, is to right a wrong. Yes, a check is nice. A check would be nice. But that's not going to completely right the wrong. And we've got to do the work in righting the wrong. And that's education, housing, employment, all of those things. So, last thing I want to say, and because I've heard this argument as well, reparations has happened. What's affirmative action? Affirmative action includes women as well, and people with disabilities. So, and many times that has happened over the years where we have tried to wrap reparations with other causes, whether it's women in general or handicap or other minority groups. We just say minorities in general and not just African Americans. And while those are all great causes, that's not reparations for African Americans specifically. White women weren't slaves. Mexican Americans weren't slaves. And they weren't viewed as such. They are not viewed as such. And so therefore, to offer them reparations or to offer them to wrap all those people in one program is not reparations. It's nice. It needs to be done. But it's not reparations. So I'm going to bang this drum. As we talked about the psychology of racism, it's going to be an uphill climb to get people to really listen about reparations and get out of the feelings, because that goes into the psychology of racism. So those two are linked, which is why I put both of them into this podcast, which made this podcast longer than I wanted it to be. And I guess, but it is what it is. They're all connected. So I'd really like to hear what you have to say about this podcast. I'd really like your feedback. So put some comments, hit me directly. I can be reached. I have a website, Sillethoughts.com, or you can go to Sillethoughts@gmail.com and send me your comments, or you can post underneath this video. This is on Facebook Live, and it'll also be on my YouTube page once the video is done. It'll be on my YouTube page, and you can comment there as well. So we'll have multiple ways for you to watch, listen, and comment about this. Give me your feedback, positive and negative. We can learn from both. I like the positive one better, but I need to hear some criticisms as well. So with that being said, thank you all for enduring and listening on this inaugural podcast recording of the My3Cents Podcast. I will be back in another week or so to give you more about what we're going to be talking about, what we're going to be discussing on the My3Cents Podcast. Today we talked about the psychology of racism and reparations. Next time, I think we need to discuss and tackle the issue of the Me Too movement. I think that line has been blurred to the point where men, and it's kind of